Somewhere in Texas right now, a robotic arm has stopped moving, not because it broke, because of a shortage nobody saw coming. In Virginia, a welder just put down his torch. In Nevada, a data center is still running, but barely. All three of them are connected to the same invisible thread, and none of them know it. Here's the strange part. This isn't about oil, it isn't about semiconductors, it isn't even about tariffs. It's about 17 elements you've probably never heard of, elements most people couldn't spell if you paid them. And for the last 2 years, they've quietly become the single most dangerous flashpoint between the United States and China. They're called rare earths. And by the end of this, you'll understand why one U.S. Treasury Secretary keeps calling emergency meetings over them. Because what's coming isn't a trade dispute, it's something closer to a siege. And most of America doesn't even know it's happening. Let's start with the man sounding the alarm. And Scott Bessent runs the U.S. Treasury. And in January 2026, he did something almost no Treasury Secretary has ever done. He called an emergency meeting, not with 2 or 3 countries, with finance ministers from the G7, plus the EU, Australia, India, South Korea, Mexico. Together, those nations represent roughly 60% of global demand for critical minerals. His message to them was blunt: the world has been moving too slowly and for too long. 6 months later, he was sitting across the table from China's vice premier, pressing Beijing to keep promises it had already made. So what exactly is everyone so afraid of? To answer that, you have to go back 50 years to 1973. That's when Arab oil producers cut off the United States. Almost overnight, the richest economy on the planet was brought to its knees. Gas lines wrapped around city blocks, prices tripled, and an entire generation of American policymakers learned something they never forgot. If your whole economy depends on one foreign supplier for a single resource, you don't just have a weakness. You have a loaded gun pointed at your own head. Now, take that same fear, and instead of oil, put in the material sitting inside every fighter jet, every electric car motor, every wind turbine, every missile guidance system, every smartphone, every AI data center on Earth. That's rare earths in 2026. And here's the number that should worry you. China controls somewhere between 80 and 90% of the world's processing capacity for these materials. Not mining, processing, because here's the twist. Nobody tells you you can dig rare earth ore out of the ground almost anywhere. The U.S. has it, Australia has it, parts of Africa have it, but turning that raw ore into something usable, a refined metal, a working magnet, that's the hard part. That's the expensive part. That's the part almost nobody outside China knows how to do at scale. That bottleneck is the whole war, and Beijing has known it for years. So what happens when you actually try to use that leverage? We got our first real answer in April 2025. China rolled out a strict new licensing regime, 7 rare earth elements aimed directly at America's defense industry. Automakers felt it almost instantly. Production lines paused, not because factories broke down, but because the magnets simply weren't arriving. Under pressure, China eased the restrictions in July 2025. And then, just 3 months later, they didn't just reverse course, they went further. October 2025, new licensing rules, and something buried inside them that alarmed trade lawyers around the world. Extraterritorial provisions, meaning Beijing could, in theory, regulate how its materials get used even after they leave Chinese soil, even by companies that have never set foot in the country. And the world braced for a full-blown trade war. And then, out of nowhere, a handshake. October 30th, 2025. An airport in South Korea. Presidents Trump and Xi sitting down together for the first time since 2019. Almost 2 hours later, they emerged with a truce. China would freeze its new controls for 1 year, and the U.S. would shelve its own planned restrictions. Trump called it an amazing meeting, said the whole rare earth issue was settled, and predicted it would get extended, quote, very routinely. But not everyone was celebrating. One Wall Street strategist said flatly that China had come out ahead in the deal. A former U.S. ambassador called it an uneasy truce inside a trade war that was still simmering underneath. And one research group summed it up in 5 words: more commotion than motion. Because here's what that truce actually said. Beijing agreed to pause an expansion, not roll anything back, not resolve anything, just pause. That skepticism turned out to be exactly right. Weeks later, in January 2026, China hit Japan with brand new export controls, a clear message. The truce didn't mean the leverage was gone. It meant Beijing would use it selectively, country by country. But the real shock came 5 months later, June 22nd, 2020 ends. China placed new export restrictions on 10 American companies. And when you look at who was on that list, it stops feeling random. MP Materials, USA Rare Earth, the 2 flagship companies at the center of America's entire plan to escape Chinese dependence. Beijing wasn't punishing random targets. It was aiming directly at the exact firms Washington was counting on to win this fight, using the exact dependency it still had to try to strangle the plan before it worked. 2 days later, China went further still. A new rule, a public reporting system, rewards for anyone who reports suspected violations of mineral export controls. Translation, an incentive to snitch. By late July, the pressure crossed into Europe. 14 EU firms had their shipments blocked, and then it got personal. 2 Japanese nationals, employees of a major company, were detained in a Chinese city in May 2026, accused of smuggling goods tied to export restrictions. One of the first known cases of foreign nationals detained inside China over a rare earth violation, and then came the number that made headlines everywhere. July 16, 2026, the International Energy Agency released a warning. If China fully enforces its export controls, it could put $6.5 trillion of manufacturing outside its borders at risk every single year. Automotive production alone faces more than $3 trillion of direct exposure. Let that sink in for a second. A material that might cost a few dollars per kilogram, sitting inside a $100 million fighter jet, inside a $40,000 car, inside a $500,000 server rack. Pull that one small piece out and the whole machine stops. That's the entire logic of this war. You don't need to control the expensive parts of the supply chain. You just need to control the smallest, most irreplaceable ones. And rare earths aren't even the only front. Is gallium, germanium, antimony, 3 more obscure materials essential for advanced chips, fiber optics, infrared sensors. China's been quietly restricting these since 2023. By December 2024, they escalated to an outright ban on shipments to the United States. That ban's been suspended for now, but the underlying licensing system never went away, and the ban on shipments to the U.S. military never lifted either. Beijing can flip that switch back whenever it wants. So here's where things get uncomfortable. The Pentagon has set a hard deadline. January 1st, 2027. After that date, U.S. defense contractors are legally barred from buying rare earths from China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. Sounds decisive, sounds like independence, except there's a problem, a big one. Industry insiders quietly admit America isn't ready. The government has poured tens of billions of dollars into roughly 150 different mineral companies, and 5 months before the deadline, executives were already calling the timeline brutal. One CEO, whose company had originally planned to start refining by 2025, admitted his firm wouldn't begin real production until 2027 at the earliest. He called the challenge, in his own words, quote, a battle. Here's the part almost nobody realizes. America actually has plenty of these minerals in the ground. What it doesn't have is the ability to process them. The refineries, the trained workforce, the permits. The U.S. hasn't produced tungsten domestically since 2015 and hasn't mined tantalum since 1959. So what is Washington actually doing about it? In February 2026, the administration quietly launched something called Project Volt, a $12 billion effort to stockpile critical minerals. And here's the detail that captures the entire contradiction of this moment. To build that stockpile fast enough, officials admitted they'd need to buy minerals from anywhere in the world, including, awkwardly, from China itself. Meanwhile, Lockheed Martin's CEO has publicly confirmed handing the Pentagon a wish list of minerals it wants stockpiled. And renewed fighting involving Iran has already started draining America's existing stockpiles of missile interceptors, a problem that used to feel theoretical. It isn't anymore. So, who's actually building the alternative? It starts with one company, MP Materials, the only operational rare earth mining company in the country, owner of the largest rare earth site in the Western Hemisphere, and responsible for more than 1/10 of global supply on its own. In July 2025, the Pentagon did something almost unthinkable for a free market administration. It bought a stake in a private company, $400 million, enough to make the U.S. government MP Materials' single largest shareholder. But the real twist was the price floor, a 10-year guarantee, a minimum of $110 per kilogram for MP's key material, no matter what happens to the global market. At the time, that same material was trading inside China for under $60 a kilogram. And the U.S. government was paying nearly double the market rate just to keep a domestic alternative alive. MP's stock jumped 50% in a single day. More money followed, another $550 million in February 2026, and bank financing for a new magnet factory, a $500 million partnership with Apple. And then something strange happened. Once MP stopped shipping its output to China, output that had quietly supplied close to 1/10 of China's own domestic production. China's own supply tightened. Rare earth prices actually surged above the price floor the Pentagon had guaranteed. Meaning, briefly, the government's insurance policy became almost unnecessary. MP wasn't the only company getting billions. USA Rare Earth landed its own $1.6 billion government package in January 2026. But the competition between these two firms got so intense that in May 2026, MP sued its rival, accusing it of stealing technology. A lawsuit that now threatens the exact supply chain resilience Washington is spending billions to build, and the money keeps spreading. Tens of millions into a Greenland mining project, millions more into a Louisiana processing complex, $500 million in loans for a Massachusetts startup. None of this is happening in isolation either. Washington has spent the past year quietly building a coalition, formal mineral frameworks signed with Australia and Japan, agreements with Malaysia and Thailand, a rapid response system to flag supply vulnerabilities in real time. South Korea pledged up to $200 billion in investment, and Japan's story here matters because Japan already lived through this exact nightmare back in 2010 when China cut off rare earth exports during a diplomatic dispute. Within 2 years, Japan cut its reliance on Chinese rare earths from 90% down to 60% through recycling, substitution, and strategic investment. That's why Japan's recycling program today, nicknamed urban mining, is one of the most advanced on Earth, hitting recovery rates above 90% for some elements. The coalition kept growing from there. The U.S., Australia, India, and Japan formed a formal critical minerals framework in May 2026. A Washington summit drew representatives from over 50 countries, and a new coordinating body was launched aimed at moving with what officials called bold and decisive action, and recycling, once an afterthought, has become a real pillar of the strategy. And right now, less than 5% of rare earth magnets are recovered globally. Most of that valuable material gets shredded into e-waste or melted anonymously into scrap steel. That's starting to change. Britain opened its first commercial rare earth recycling plant in 25 years. In January 2026, the EU now legally requires a quarter of its strategic mineral use to come from recycling by 2030. So step back, look at the whole board. On one side, China, controlling 80 to 90% of global processing, a tight grip on gallium and germanium too, and a demonstrated willingness to weaponize export licenses against countries, companies, even individuals. On the other side, a coalition of allies throwing tens of billions of dollars at mines, refineries, magnet factories, and stockpiles, racing toward a deadline that even the people building it privately admit they might miss. And caught in between the companies that actually make the modern world run, automakers, defense contractors, chip makers, the people building the infrastructure behind artificial intelligence, all of them now treating a handful of gray metallic elements with the same seriousness once reserved for crude oil. Because this story reaches far beyond magnets and electric cars, and it touches artificial intelligence, because the data centers training tomorrow's AI models depend on these exact materials. It touches national defense, because fighter jets and precision missiles are saturated with rare earth magnets that have no easy substitute. It touches the energy transition, since EV motors and wind turbines are among the largest sources of demand on the planet. It touches ordinary consumer electronics, because the phone sitting in your pocket right now almost certainly contains a rare earth magnet that passed through a facility inside China at some point. But here's the twist. The one thing most coverage of this story misses entirely. China's aggression might actually be backfiring in slow motion. Every time Beijing tightens the screws, it hands Washington one more politically unstoppable reason to keep funding the alternative. Price floors that looked reckless in mid-2025 look, a year later, like the only reason a Western rare earth industry exists at all. Every restriction accelerates the exact decoupling China is trying to prevent, because it proves to nervous executives and defense planners exactly why they can't afford to depend on a single supplier ever again. That's the trap sitting underneath this entire conflict. The more effectively China uses this leverage today, the less leverage it's likely to have 5 or 10 years from now, once the mines, refineries, and recycling plants currently under construction across California, Texas, Louisiana, Australia, Japan, and Greenland finally come online. But 5 or 10 years is a long time. Right now, today, the United States remains deeply, uncomfortably dependent, and the gap between the ambition of January 2027 and the reality on the ground isn't a rounding error. It's measured in years of construction, years of permitting, years of training a workforce that right now mostly doesn't exist. There's one more twist worth knowing, something that rarely makes headlines. China's own domestic mining quotas have actually been trending lower, not higher, even as global demand keeps climbing. One likely reason prices firmed up even before the latest round of restrictions hit. A country that built its entire geopolitical leverage on cheap, abundant supply is now quietly managing its own resources more carefully, aware, perhaps, that decades of underpriced extraction come with real long-term costs of their own. Not weakness, exactly, but a reminder that even the dominant player in this market isn't operating from unlimited, effortless abundance. So where does this actually end? Honestly, nobody fully knows. Not the Pentagon, not the Treasury, not the analysts pricing rare earth futures day by day. But here's what is clear. The United States doesn't need to produce every single mineral on its own soil to be safe. It needs enough diversified, redundant sources across enough countries that no single foreign government, however powerful, can hold the entire advanced manufacturing base of the free world hostage with one ministry announcement. That's the real goal hiding behind every mine opening, every government equity stake, every price floor, every bilateral deal. Not total self-sufficiency, that's probably impossible. Resilience, redundancy, enough leverage of its own that the next crisis doesn't turn into a full-blown embargo. The real question, the one that actually matters, is whether America and its allies can finish building that resilience before the next major confrontation with Beijing, rather than scrambling to build it in the middle of one, and the way they scrambled in April 2025, and again in June 2026, and very likely will scramble again before this decade is over, because in the next real clash between the United States and China, the most consequential weapon on the table almost certainly won't be a tariff. It almost certainly won't be a warship. It'll be a mineral you can't even pronounce, weighing only a few grams, sitting quietly inside a machine worth millions of dollars.